The war drums had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Dura Stonefist stood at the center of the trading post's dusty commons, her twin axes crossed and driven into the packed earth before her, and she raised her voice so it carried over every wagon, every stall, every human who had gathered to watch her clan's fury unfold. "I demand trial by combat," she said, and her voice was iron wrapped in velvet, deep and resonant, carrying the accent of the High Plains clans. "Blood for blood, or a champion to stand in blood's place. That is the old law. That is the law your own kind swore to honor 3 generations past." The crowd murmured. Merchants clutched their strongboxes. A dozen riflemen from the post's garrison shifted their grips on their weapons, but none of them dared raise a barrel toward her, not with her own honor guard of 6 orc warriors flanking her, not with the promise of a warband camped 3 miles out on the ridge line, waiting for a word that would send them down like a flood. Marshal Thomas Bellwether, the post's appointed lawkeeper, stood on the porch of the trading hall with sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. "Chieftess Stonefist," he said, "there is no need for blood. The boy who stole your kinsman's horse will be punished under our own law." "Your law," Dura said, and there was scorn in it, "hanged an orc child last winter for taking bread from a grain cart that had spoiled and would have gone to rot regardless. I do not trust your law. I trust the old way. A champion for your side. A champion for mine. Let the gods and the strength of arms decide whether this post burns or stands." The crowd's murmur turned to something colder, more frightened. Bellwether's eyes swept the gathered townsfolk, the merchants, the drovers, the trappers who wintered here, the handful of soldiers garrisoned at the post's edge searching for anyone foolish enough or brave enough to volunteer to die. No one moved. Emmett Walker was standing near the back of the crowd, arms black to the elbow with forged soot, having come running from his smithy at the first sound of raised voices, expecting a fire or a runaway team of horses. Not this. He was a broad-shouldered man of 32 years, plain-faced in a way that made him easy to overlook, with sandy hair going darker with sweat and gray eyes that had seen things he never spoke of. He had lived at the Split Rock trading post for going on 2 years now under the name Emmett Walker, a name that was not the one he had been born with, working the forge, because a man's hands remember a trade even when his heart has forgotten who he used to be. He was not looking to be noticed. He had spent 2 years making certain of that. Then Dura Stonefist's dark eyes found him across the crowd, and something in her expression shifted, not softened, not exactly, but sharpened, the way a hunter's gaze sharpens on something unexpected in the brush. "You," she said, and pointed one gauntleted hand directly at him. "The blacksmith." The crowd parted from around him as if he had suddenly caught fire. "I name him," Dura Stonefist said, loud enough that the whole commons could hear it, loud enough that it would be repeated in taverns and campfires for 100 miles in every direction. "I name the blacksmith as my champion, if he will stand for his post the way none of these cowards will stand for their own kin. Let us see if human iron matches orc steel, blacksmith. Let us see what your hands are truly worth." Emmett Walker stood very still, his heart hammering, and for one strange, suspended moment, all he could think was that her eyes were the deep amber brown of good whiskey held up to firelight, and that he had never in his life been looked at quite like that. Not with fear, not with pity, but with a fierce and total attention, as if he were the only thing in the world worth seeing. It would be 2 months before that moment made sense to him. But that was where it started, and everything that came after, the fire between them, the duel that would leave the whole trading post breathless, the slow unraveling of the secret he carried, the choice she made when she could have chosen any warrior in her clan, all of it traced back to this. A chieftess pointing a finger through a frightened crowd, and a disgraced knight hiding inside a blacksmith's leather apron, about to become the last thing either of them expected. 2 months earlier, Emmett Walker had arrived at Split Rock with nothing but a horse, a set of tools wrapped in oilcloth, and a name that was not his own. He had been a knight once, sworn to a lord in the eastern valleys, until a battle gone wrong and a commander's cowardice had been laid at his feet instead of where it belonged. He had refused to speak the truth that would have damned another man to save himself, and so he had lost his spurs, his lands, his name, and very nearly his life, exiled west along the wagon roads where no one asked too many questions of a man who could shoe a horse and mend a plow blade. Split Rock Trading Post sat at the elbow of the High Plains Road, where the wagon trail bent around a shoulder of red rock before descending toward the river crossings further south. It was not a large place, a trading hall, a saloon with 3 rooms above it, a scattering of cabins, a garrison of a dozen soldiers who mostly kept the peace between drunk drovers, and Emmett's forge at the northern edge where the road came down off the ridge. It was a place people passed through, not a place people stayed, which suited Emmett Walker perfectly. He wanted no roots. Roots could be found and dug up and burned. He had heard of the Orcs, of course. Everyone on the High Plains had heard of the Stonefist clan, who held the grazing lands north of the ridge, and who had fought 3 wars against human settlers in the memory of men still living. There was an uneasy truce now, brokered a decade back, but truces on the High Plains were like ice on a spring river, solid enough to look at, treacherous to trust. He had not expected to meet their chieftess over a broken wagon wheel. It happened on a bright, cold autumn morning, 6 weeks before the trial by combat, when a supply caravan bound for the Orc encampment broke an axle on the switchback below the ridge. The teamsters, terrified of the armed Orc escort riding with the caravan under treaty right, had refused to go near the wreckage, certain that any delay would be blamed on them and paid for in blood. Emmett had walked up from his forge with a hammer, a coil of chain, and no particular fear in him, because fear, he had found, was a thing he had mostly burned out of himself in the years since his disgrace. Dura Stonefist had been sitting astride a broad-chested gray warhorse at the head of the escort, and when he first saw her clearly, he nearly dropped the chain. She wore fitted leathers dyed the deep brown red of dried blood, laced tight along her sides and across a bodice that hugged a powerful, curved frame, with vambraces of hammered bronze at her forearms and a belt hung with twin-hand axes. Her black hair was pulled back in a thick braid threaded with small bronze rings that caught the morning light, and her skin was the deep green-gray of river stone, marked at one temple with a thin pale scar that did nothing to diminish and everything to enhance the fierce, striking beauty of her face. She was taller than him by half a head even mounted, with tusks that curved neatly from her lower jaw, small enough to be elegant rather than brutish, and eyes that missed nothing. "You are not one of the wagon men," she had said, studying him the way a smith studies a blade for flaws. "No, ma'am, I'm the blacksmith from the post, Emmett Walker." He had set down the chain and looked at the broken axle and then back up at her because it seemed rude not to. "That axle's not going anywhere without a forge. I can pull the wheel, splint the axle enough to get you down off the switchback and have it properly repaired within the day if you're willing to make camp near the post. You are not afraid of us." "I didn't say that." He'd allowed himself a small, tired smile. "I said I can fix your wheel." Being afraid doesn't stop a man's hands from working, if the work needs doing. Something had moved behind her eyes, then surprise, maybe, or the first thread of the interest that would grow between them like a slow fire catching in dry grass. "You are bold, Blacksmith, for a man standing this close to Orc steel." "I've stood closer to worse and lived," he'd said before he could stop himself, and regretted it instantly, because it invited questions he did not want to answer. She had not asked then. She had only looked at him a long moment, the autumn wind pulling a loose strand of black hair across her cheek, and said, "Fix the wheel, Blacksmith. I will watch you work." She had watched him work for 6 hours that day, sitting on a fallen log at the edge of his forge with her chin in her hand, asking sharp, curious questions about the tempering of steel and the shaping of iron, and he had found himself talking more in that one afternoon than he had in the whole 2 years since he'd come to Split Rock, telling her about ore and heat, and the patience a good blade demanded. though he was careful never to mention swords he had once carried under a different name. By the time the wheel was mended and the wagon rolled on toward the Orc encampment, something had been kindled in both of them that neither was yet willing to name. And Emmett Walker, lying awake that night in the small room above his forge, found himself thinking of amber-brown eyes and a low, warm laugh he had coaxed out of her only once, when he'd singed his own sleeve and cursed with more feeling than sense. She came back 3 days later alone, on the pretense of needing a mended axe head, and stayed until sundown talking with him at his forge. And Emmett understood with a lurch somewhere beneath his ribs that Dura Stonefist, chieftess of a clan that had buried human raiders by the dozen in her grandmother's time, had decided she wanted to know him, and that a woman like that, once decided, was not easily turned aside. It was on her 4th visit, 2 weeks after the broken wheel, that she kissed him. They had been standing at the edge of the forge yard in the blue hour after sunset, the fire banked low behind them, and she had reached out and taken his soot-stained hand in her much larger, calloused one, turning it over to study the burned scars along his knuckles the way she might study a map. "Your hands," she'd said, "have known more than fire." "Everyone's hands know something," he'd answered, throat tight, because her thumb was tracing slow, deliberate circles against his palm, and it was doing dangerous things to his composure. "You carry yourself like a soldier, Blacksmith, not like a man born to a forge. Maybe I was a soldier once, and now I'm nobody in particular. Just a man who fixes wheels and shoes horses and tries not to be noticed." She had looked at him then with an expression he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe, and never quite managed something fierce and tender at once, something that saw straight through the plain name and the leather apron to whatever remained of the man underneath. "I notice you," she had said low, and closed the distance between them, and kissed him before he could think of a single reason to stop her. It was not a soft, uncertain kiss. Dura Stonefist did nothing by half measures, and she kissed him the way she did everything, with total, consuming intent, one hand curling into the front of his shirt to pull him closer, the other cradling the back of his skull. And Emmett, stunned and burning, had wrapped his arms around her waist and kissed her back with 2 years of loneliness breaking open all at once. When she finally pulled back, breathless, her eyes bright with something fierce and pleased, she had said, "You kiss like a man who has been waiting a long time for someone to want him." "Maybe I have been," he'd admitted, and she had laughed, that low, warm laugh he'd only heard once before, and kissed him again, softer this time, lingering, and Emmett Walker had understood that whatever else happened, whatever he had been before he came to Split Rock, he did not want to be anywhere else in the world but exactly where he stood. But the high plains did not care about two hearts finding each other in the blue hour after sunset. The trouble had already been building for a year before Emmett ever came to Split Rock, and it did not stop building simply because a chieftess had fallen for a blacksmith. The trouble was this: a faction of young human ranchers, led by a hard, ambitious man named Garrett Voss, had begun pushing cattle onto the northern grazing range that the Treaty of 10 Years Past had granted to the Stonefist clan. Voss argued, loudly and often, that treaties made with orcs were not treaties at all but temporary conveniences, and that the northern range was too good to leave to green-skinned savages, while human herds went hungry on the poorer southern grass. Dura had held her warriors back for months, trusting that Marshal Bellwether and the post's garrison would enforce the treaty's boundaries as promised. But patience among her own clan was wearing thin, and when Voss's men shot 2 orc scouts who had ridden into the disputed range to check on cattle encroachment, wounding one badly, killing his horse outright, the balance had tipped hard toward war. It was in the aftermath of that shooting, 3 weeks after their first kiss, that the horse theft incident occurred. A drunk young orc warrior named Krev, furious over his wounded kinsman, had ridden into the post at night and stolen a prize stallion from Voss's own stable in retaliation, and Voss had demanded blood for it before the marshal could even investigate properly. That was the spark. Dura had come to the post to negotiate, to try to keep the peace her clan had held for a decade, only to find Voss and his allies already demanding Krev be hanged without trial, treaty right be damned. And so, cornered by human intransigence and unwilling to let her own people be dishonored by a lynching, she had invoked the old law, the ancient right, older than the current treaty, that either side of a dispute between clans could demand trial by combat rather than let blood be spilled in an uneven fight. It was meant, in the old law, to prevent exactly the kind of massacre that a war between her war band and Voss's armed ranchers would become. One champion, one duel. The dispute settled cleanly without dragging 100 lives into the ground, and she had named Emmett Walker. Standing in the crowd, staring at Dura's outstretched, pointing hand, Emmett felt the whole commons watching him, waiting to see if he would run or refuse or beg off with some excuse about being only a blacksmith and no warrior. Marshal Bellwether stepped down off the porch, his face pale. "Chieftess Stonefist, this is madness. He's a blacksmith, not a soldier." "Then let him refuse," Dura said, without looking away from Emmett. "Let him refuse, and let the record show that not one man in this post had the courage to stand for it. And I will lead my clan home, and we will settle this the old way. The way it was always going to be settled if your kind will not honor the treaty." Her eyes, fixed on Emmett's, held something he alone could read not command, but a plea disguised as a demand, a desperate hope that he would understand what she was truly asking of him. She was giving him a way out of the lie he had been living, and a way to save every soul in this dusty little post at once, if only he had the courage to take it. Garrett Voss, standing near the front of the crowd with his hired men flanking him, sneered. "The blacksmith won't fight, look at him. He shoes horses, he's no more a warrior than my saddle." Emmett Walker felt something old and buried stir in his chest, not anger at Voss, though there was plenty of that, but the specific, familiar weight of a challenge laid down in front of witnesses, a weight his body remembered from another life in another name on other battlefields. He stepped forward. "I'll stand," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried in the sudden hush. "I'll stand as her champion." The crowd erupted into murmurs, Voss's face twisting with contempt and something like alarm, and Dura Stonefist's expression for just an instant, before she mastered it back into fierce composure, broke open into something raw and grateful and afraid, all at once, the look of a woman who had gambled everything on a man she had only known 6 weeks and found he would not fail her. "Then it is settled," she said, loud enough for the whole commons to hear. "Voss names his champion. The blacksmith stands for the post, 2 days from now, at dawn, on the open ground below the ridge. Blood for blood, or the dispute ends here cleanly, as the old law intends." Voss's champion, it turned out, was a broad, scarred mercenary named Halric Coombs, a man who had fought in 3 border wars and killed more men than he could likely remember, hired specifically for his size and his brutality, a man who had never lost a duel in 15 years of fighting for coin. Emmett Walker had 2 days to prepare to fight him to the death. That night, after the crowd had dispersed and the post had settled into a tense, whispering quiet, Dura came to his forge. She did not knock. She simply appeared in the doorway, backlit by the banked coals, still in her fitted leathers, her twin axes at her hips, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "You did not have to do that," she said finally. "You knew I would. I hoped you would. That is not the same as knowing." She crossed the small space between them, and up close he could see the fear she had hidden from the crowd, the tightness at the corners of her eyes. "Coombs has killed a dozen men in the circle, Emmett. He is not some drunk drover. If you die out there, I won't. You cannot promise that." Her hands closed over the front of his shirt, not pulling him close this time but gripping, as if she were trying to hold him still against some current threatening to sweep him away. "I named you because I could not bear to watch this post burn and its people die in a war neither side wants, and because—" She stopped, jaw tight, and he saw her force the words out anyway, "because Dura Stonefist did not flinch from truth even when it cost her. Because I did not trust anyone else's hands with something that matters this much to me. But if I have sent you to your death because I was too much a coward to admit that, I will never, Dura." He caught her hands in his, soot-stained and scarred, and held them against his chest, over the steady, stubborn beat of his heart. "Look at me." She looked at him. "I was not always a blacksmith," he said, and the words came out of him easier than he expected, 2 years of silence finally breaking, because she deserved to know before he stood in a circle and possibly died in front of her. "I was a knight, once, sworn to a lord in the eastern valleys. I fought in 3 campaigns. I killed men with a sword before I ever picked up a hammer. I lost my name, my lands, and my honor when I refused to lie for a coward commander who let good men die and blamed it on me to save his own skin. I have been Emmett Walker for 2 years because the man I used to be does not exist anymore in any record that matters. But my hands remember how to fight, Dura. They have not forgotten, even if I wish they had." She stared at him, absorbing this, her grip on his hands tightening rather than loosening. "You let this post believe you were only a smith. I let everyone believe that. It was easier than being known." He held her gaze steady. "You are the first person in 2 years I have wanted to be truly known by." Something in her face cracked open then, fierce and vulnerable at once, and she pulled him against her and kissed him with a desperate hunger that spoke of everything she had not let herself say: fear for him, want of him, the terror of having named him her champion, and the deeper terror of what it would mean to lose him now that she had found him. "Then fight as the man you were," she murmured against his mouth, "not the man you have hidden behind. Show me the knight, Emmett Walker." "I did not fall for a blacksmith's hands alone. I fell for whatever is underneath them." "You fell for me?" he asked low, needing to hear her say it plainly. Dura Stonefist, chieftess of the Stonefist clan, who feared no warrior on the high plains and had buried men twice Emmett's size without losing a night's sleep over it, looked at him with something achingly soft beneath the fierce planes of her face and said, "I have fallen for no one else in all my years, human. Do not make me regret choosing you." "I won't," he said again, and this time she believed him. They spent that night together in the small room above the forge, and it was not gentle in the way of a first tentative touch. Dura Stonefist did not know how to want carefully, and Emmett, freed at last of 2 years of hiding, met her with the same fierce hunger, both of them clinging to warmth against the fear of the dawn that was coming. It was intimate and consuming, and beneath the heat of it, tender in a way that surprised them both, her hands mapping the old scars on his body with something like reverence, his mouth finding the pulse at her throat and the curve of her jaw with a devotion that had nothing to do with lust alone. When they finally lay quiet in the dark, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing slow lines along her spine, she said very softly, "Whatever happens in that circle, Emmett Walker, know that you are already mine. I do not give my heart lightly, and I do not take it back once given." "Then I am the luckiest man on the high plains," he murmured into her hair, "disgraced knight or no." She laughed, low and warm, and he felt it against his ribs like a promise. The day before the duel, word of the trial by combat had spread up and down the wagon road, and Split Rock swelled with onlookers, drovers who delayed their runs, trappers come down from the hills, a handful of orc warriors from Dura's own warband standing grim-faced at the edge of camp, and Voss's ranch hands swaggering through the commons as if the outcome were already decided. Emmett spent the day at his forge, not idle but working with fierce concentration, and Dura found him there in the late afternoon, hammering at a length of steel with more precision than his old apprentice work had ever shown. "What are you making?" she asked, watching the sparks fly. "A sword," he said. "The post armory has nothing worth carrying into a circle against a man like Coombs. I'm not fighting him with a farrier's hammer." She watched him work for a long while, arms crossed, something proud and fierce settling over her features as she saw, for the first time, the knight beneath the blacksmith emerging in the confident, practiced motions of his hands, not the tentative strikes of a man learning a trade, but the sure, economical movements of someone who had once been trained to make exactly this, quickly and well. When the blade was quenched and the steam hissed up around them, she said, "You fight better with words than most men fight with swords, Emmett Walker. I hope your steel matches your tongue." "We'll find out at dawn," he said, and managed a smile despite the tightness in his chest. That evening Marshal Bellwether came to the forge alone, hat in his hands, looking older than he had that morning. "I want you to know," he said, "that I tried to talk Voss out of this. He wouldn't hear it, says he's tired of being the reasonable one while orcs push onto good grazing land." "The grazing land is theirs by treaty," Emmett said, testing the balance of his new blade. "I know that. Most folks here know that. But fear makes men stupid, and there's plenty of fear to go around." Bellwether hesitated. "For what it's worth, son, whoever you were before you came here, whatever name you left behind, the way you stepped up today in front of that whole crowd when every other man in this post stood silent, that took more courage than most soldiers I've known ever showed. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already proven something worth proving." Emmett looked up at him, surprised by the kindness of it. "Thank you, Marshal. Don't thank me, just don't die out there. This post needs men like you a good deal more than it needs men like Voss, and I suspect a certain chieftess would burn this whole place to ash if you didn't come back to her." He left before Emmett could find a response to that, and Emmett stood alone in the forge a long while, turning the new blade over in his hands, thinking of amber-brown eyes and a fierce, guarded heart that had chosen him against every reasonable instinct of self-preservation, and found that whatever fear he carried into tomorrow's dawn was outweighed, entirely and simply, by the fact that he did not want to disappoint her. Dawn came gray and cold, with frost silvering the dead grass on the open ground below the ridge, where the duel circle had been marked out with stakes and rope. The whole post had turned out, along with Dura's warband riding down from their camp on the ridge, and the two crowds gathered on opposite sides of the circle like the banks of a river about to flood. Dura Stonefist stood at the edge nearest her own people, dressed in her fitted battle leathers, her face a mask of fierce composure that Emmett alone could see was costing her everything to hold steady. Across the circle, Garrett Voss stood with his arms crossed, smug and certain, beside the towering, scarred bulk of Howrick Coombs, who was stripping off a heavy fur cloak to reveal a chest crossed with old battle scars and a broadsword nearly as long as Emmett was tall. Emmett Walker walked into the circle carrying the sword he had forged with his own hands through the night, wearing no armor but a leather jerkin reinforced with iron rivets, because there had been no time to make more, and because a knight's old instincts told him speed would serve him better than weight against a man of Coombs's size. "Last chance to run, Smith," Coombs called out, grinning, showing teeth gone yellow with age and tobacco. "I've killed prettier men than you for less coin than this." "Then let's not waste your morning," Emmett said, and settled into a stance that made Coombs's grin falter just slightly at the sudden, unmistakable competence of it. Marshal Bellwether, standing as arbiter between the two camps, raised his hand. "By the old law, this circle is bound. First blood is not enough. This is settled to the death or to yield, and yield ends the dispute in favor of the one who stands. Combatants begin." Coombs came at him first, fast for a man his size, the broadsword swinging in a wide arc meant to end things quickly through sheer overwhelming force. Emmett did not meet it head-on. He had learned better than that a lifetime ago, in another name, on other fields, and instead pivoted low, and let the blade whistle past close enough to stir his hair, driving in with his own sword toward Coombs's exposed side. Coombs was faster than his size suggested and twisted away, cursing, and the two men circled each other while the crowd's noise rose and fell like a tide. Voss's men shouting for blood, the Orc warband shouting Dura's name and Emmett's in a rhythm that sounded almost like a chant, and beneath all of it, cutting through, Dura's own voice, sharp and clear. "Emmett, watch his left hand, he favors a hidden blade." He barely had time to register the warning before Coombs's offhand flashed with a short knife aimed at his ribs beneath the guard of the broadsword, and Emmett twisted just enough to take the cut along his forearm instead of his side, gritting through the burn of it, driving his elbow into Coombs's jaw in retaliation with enough force to stagger the bigger man back a full step. Blood ran warm down Emmett's arm, and the crowd gasped as one. But he did not go down, and in the sudden opening left by Coombs's stagger, Emmett drove forward with a speed that surprised everyone watching everyone except, perhaps, Dura, who had seen the way he moved at the forge and known there was more to him than the plain name he wore. Steel met steel in a shrieking clash, again and again, the two men trading blows across the frozen ground, and though Coombs's strength was terrible, Emmett's training years buried under a blacksmith's apron, never truly forgotten, began to show itself in the economy of his movements, the way he wasted no strike, the way he read the larger man's shifting weight a half-second before each swing. Coombs, growing frustrated as his heavier blows failed to connect, roared and threw himself forward in a reckless overhead strike meant to end the fight through pure violence. And it was the opening Emmett had been waiting for. Through every exchange he stepped inside the arc of the blow rather than away from it, close enough to feel the wind of the descending broadsword pass over his shoulder, and drove his own sword up and through, ending the fight in a single, brutal, decisive thrust. Halric Coombs fell to his knees, then forward onto the frozen ground, and did not rise again. For a moment the whole commons was utterly silent, both crowds staring at the fallen mercenary and the bloodied, breathing blacksmith standing over him. And then Dura Stonefist's voice broke the silence with a raw, fierce cry of triumph that was answered a heartbeat later by the warband's roar. And Emmett Walker, disgraced knight, humble smith, unlikely champion, sank down onto one knee in the frost-silvered grass as the exhaustion and the pain of his wound finally caught up with him all at once. Dura crossed the circle before anyone could stop her, ignoring the old law's formalities entirely, and dropped to her knees beside him, her hands cupping his face, checking him over with a desperate, thorough urgency. "You are hurt," she said, finding the cut along his forearm, blood still welling dark through the torn sleeve. "I'm alive," he said, and managed a tired, crooked smile up at her. That was the important part. "You terrified me," she said, fierce and furious and relieved all at once, and then she kissed him, right there in the circle in front of both crowds, uncaring of who watched, and the Orc warband roared its approval while the human crowd stood in stunned, uncertain silence, watching their chieftess kiss the blacksmith who had just won them their peace. Garrett Voss did not take his champion's death well. "This proves nothing," he shouted, pushing forward toward the circle's edge, his face red with fury and humiliation. "One duel doesn't give them the right to that range." "The old law is clear, Voss," Marshal Bellwether said, stepping between him and the circle, his voice hard in a way Emmett had not heard from the marshal before. "You demanded the trial. Your champion is dead. The dispute is settled, and settled means settled. If you push cattle onto that range again, you'll answer to the garrison first and the Stonefist clan second, and I doubt you'll enjoy either conversation." Voss looked around at the crowd, at the faces of drovers and trappers and merchants who had watched a blacksmith stand where none of them would, who had watched him bleed and win, who were looking now at Voss himself with something considerably less than sympathy, and found no support anywhere in the gathered post. Whatever momentum his cause had carried into that morning had bled out onto the frozen ground along with Halric Coombs. "This isn't over," he muttered, but it was the muttering of a man who knew, even as he said it, that it was. He turned and stalked away, his hired men trailing after him, and the crowd's tension broke all at once into a confused, relieved murmur that would, within a day, turn into the kind of story told and retold at every tavern along the wagon road, the tale of the blacksmith who had stood as an Orc Chieftess's champion and won. Dura helped Emmett to his feet, one arm braced firmly around his waist, and looked up at him with an expression that held equal parts fierce pride and lingering fear at how close it had come to going the other way. "Come," she said. "Your arm needs tending, and I do not trust anyone else's hands with that either." She took him to the small room above the forge, and cleaned and bound the wound herself with a gentleness that seemed almost incongruous coming from hands that had, an hour before, gripped an axe in readiness to join the fight herself if it had gone wrong. When it was done, she sat beside him on the narrow bed, her hand resting over his bandaged forearm, and was quiet for a long moment. "I have led my clan for 6 years," she said finally. "I have buried warriors I loved like kin. I have never once in all that time feared for a single life the way I feared for yours in that circle." She looked at him, searching his face. "I do not know what to do with that fear, Emmett Walker. I'm not accustomed to being afraid of anything." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said gently, covering her hand with his own. "Just let it be what it is. It's only love wearing a frightening face." "Love," she repeated, testing the word the way she might test the balance of a new axe. "Unless I've misread things badly," he said, with a small, hopeful smile, "in which case I've made an even greater fool of myself than fighting Coombs would have made me." She laughed then, that low, warm sound he had come to treasure above almost anything else in his narrow, careful life, and leaned in to kiss him, slow and lingering, all the fierce urgency of the morning settling into something quieter and deeper. "You have not misread anything," she said against his mouth. "I chose you in that crowd because some part of me already knew what I wanted, even before I understood I wanted it. I am not a woman who chooses lightly, human. When I choose for good." "Then choose me again," he said, only half joking, "because I intend to spend a great deal of time making sure you never regret it." "I intend to hold you to that," she murmured, and kissed him again. Word of the duel spread far beyond Split Rock within the Weecup and down the wagon road, into the ranching towns further south. Even, it was said, to the ears of the regional lord who nominally oversaw the treaty lands, and Marshal Bellwether found himself, for once in his tenure, presiding over a post that people spoke of with something like awe rather than the usual weary tolerance reserved for a dusty waypoint on a long road. But fame was not without complication, and it was in the 3rd week after the duel, with Emmett's arm healed to a thin, pale scar, and the frost of early winter beginning to harden the ground in earnest, that the complication arrived in the form of a rider from the Easta man. Emmett recognized the moment he saw him cresting the ridge road, recognized with a lurch of dread that turned his blood to ice despite the forge's heat. Sir Aldrich Payne. Once a fellow knight under the same disgraced lord, now, apparently, risen to some standing under a new banner, riding into Split Rock with 2 armed retainers, and a look on his face that told Emmett this was no chance encounter. "Well," Aldrich said, reining in his horse at the edge of the forge yard, looking Emmett up and down with cold amusement, "if it isn't Sir Emmett Draven, hiding behind a farrier's apron and an invented name. I heard tales riding up the road of a blacksmith who dueled like a trained knight and won a fight against Howrick Coombs, of all men. I confess I did not believe it until I saw your face just now." Dura, who had been at the forge helping Emmett stack cooling iron, straightened at the sound of an unfamiliar name, Draven, her eyes narrowing sharply between the 2 men. "Emmett," she said slowly, "who is this man and what does he mean, calling you by another name?" Emmett's jaw tightened, the old shame rising in him like bile, but he had promised himself 2 years ago and again, more fiercely 3 weeks ago in a bloodied circle, that he would not hide from truth again, not from her, not from anyone. "My name," he said, meeting her eyes steadily, "was Emmett Draven before I lost my knighthood. Sir Aldrich here served under the same lord I did, in the campaign that ended my career and very nearly my life." Aldrich laughed, a thin, unpleasant sound. "Ended your career? That's a generous way to describe refusing to lie for Lord Harwick when the truth would have saved him a great deal of embarrassment. You could have kept your lands, your name, everything, if you'd simply agreed that the retreat order came from you rather than him. Instead you chose honor over sense, and here you are," he gestured at the forge, at the soot, at the whole humble scene around them, "shoeing horses on the edge of nowhere." "I chose not to let good men be blamed for a coward's mistake," Emmett said quietly. "I would make the same choice again." "Noble," Aldrich said, in a tone that made it sound like an insult. "Lord Harwick is dead now, did you know that? Choked on his own arrogance in a border skirmish 2 winters back. His successor has been quietly reviewing old grievances, restoring names unjustly stripped, now that the truth of that campaign has come fully to light through other testimony. I was sent to find you, Emmett Draven, and offer you your name and your lands back, if you're willing to return east and reclaim what was taken from you." The forge yard was very quiet. Emmett felt Dura's eyes on him, steady and searching, and understood with a strange, vertiginous clarity that this was a moment that could unmake everything he had built in the last 2 years, or reveal exactly how much of it was worth keeping. "And if I refuse?" Emmett asked. Aldrich shrugged. "Then you stay here, a blacksmith with a false name, and the offer lapses. It makes no difference to me either way. I was sent to deliver the message, not to convince you." His eyes flicked, not unkindly, toward Dura. "Though I confess I'm curious what could keep a man from wanting his old life back, when the old life was one most men would kill for." Emmett was quiet a long moment, looking at the man he had once called comrade, feeling the weight of the offer settle over him, land, name, honor restored, everything that had been stripped from him in a single unjust stroke, his for the taking. Then he looked at Dura Stonefist, standing beside his forge in her fitted battle leathers, soot on her hands from helping him stack iron, her dark eyes steady and unreadable and waiting, and he found the answer had already made itself before he'd finished hearing the question. "Tell whoever sent you that I'm grateful for the offer," Emmett said, "and that I decline it. I have everything I want right here." Aldrich raised an eyebrow, glancing between Emmett and Dura with new understanding dawning across his features. "An Orc Chieftess. Well, that will make for interesting talk back east, when I tell them the reason Sir Emmett Draven refused his own restoration." "Tell them whatever you like," Emmett said. "I don't answer to that name anymore, and I don't answer to that life. I'm Emmett Walker. I make horseshoes and mend wagon wheels, and I stood as champion for a woman who is worth more to me than any title I ever held. That's the whole of it." Aldrich studied him a long moment, then, surprisingly, something like respect crossed his face. "You always were too stubborn for your own good, Draven Walker, I suppose now." He nodded once, turned his horse, and rode back the way he'd come, his retainers falling in behind him, leaving the forge yard quiet in his wake. Dura did not speak until the sound of hoofbeats had faded entirely, and when she did, her voice was low and careful, testing. "You could have had your name back, your lands. I could have. You said no in front of me without even a moment to think it over privately." "I didn't need a moment," Emmett said, turning to face her fully. "Dura, I spent 2 years thinking the worst thing that ever happened to me was losing my name. And then you looked at me across a crowd and pointed your finger and said, 'The blacksmith.' And everything I thought I'd lost stopped mattering, because I'd found something I didn't even know I was looking for." He reached out and took her hand, soot-stained fingers threading with his own. "I don't want to be Sir Emmett Draven again. I want to be exactly who I am right now here with you. If that's a smaller life than the one I lost, then I choose the smaller life gladly, every single time." Dura was quiet a long moment, her amber-brown eyes bright with an emotion she rarely allowed to show so plainly, and then she pulled him close and held him, her face pressed against his shoulder, her arms fierce and tight around him. "No one has ever chosen me over something so large," she said, muffled against his shirt. "Warriors have wanted my clan's alliance. Suitors have wanted my father's old lands. No one has simply chosen me, plainly, the way you just did." "Then get used to it," Emmett murmured into her hair, "because I intend to keep choosing you for a very long time." Winter came down hard that year, harder than the post had seen in a decade, and it was the storm that finally sealed what had been building between them since that first broken wagon wheel. It began as an ordinary snow, the kind that dusted the ridge road most winters and melted within a week. But the wind shifted 3 days in and brought a second storm hard on the heels of the first. and within the span of 5 days split rock found itself buried under drifts higher than a man's head. The wagon rode impassable in either direction, the post entirely cut off from the outside world. Dura's war band, camped on the ridge, retreated to the shelter of the post itself at Marshal Bellwether's urging rather than risk exposure in their hide tents through the worst of the storm, an unprecedented gesture of trust from both sides that would have been unthinkable even a season before. The Orc warriors bunked in the trading hall's storage rooms. Dura's own honor guard took shelter in the saloon's spare rooms, and Dura herself, after 2 nights of stubborn insistence on staying with her own people, finally accepted Emmett's quiet offer of the room above the forge, where the banked coals kept warmth through even the coldest nights. They were, for all practical purposes, snowed in together, the whole post reduced to a handful of buildings, and a shared, enforced closeness that stripped away the last of any pretense between them. It was on the 3rd night of the deepest storm, with wind howling against the shuttered windows, and the forge fire burned down to a low red glow, that Dura Stonefist finally spoke the words that had been building in her since the duel, since the broken wagon wheel, since the very first moment she had looked across a crowd and seen something worth wanting in a soot-covered blacksmith's steady gray eyes. "There is a custom among my people," she said, sitting close beside him on the narrow bed, her fingers laced with his, the firelight catching the bronze rings in her braided hair. "When a warrior chooses a mate, not a marriage of clans or convenience, but a true choosing made freely, with the heart, there is a mark given. A claiming mark cut here." She touched 2 fingers to the curve of her own shoulder and answered in kind on the one chosen. "It is not done lightly. It is not undone once given." Emmett studied her carefully in the low firelight. "You're asking me something." "I am telling you what I want," Dura said, with the same fierce directness she brought to everything, though he could hear, beneath it, a rare thread of vulnerability. "I have never given this mark to anyone, Emmett Walker. I did not think I would find anyone worth giving it to." And then a wagon wheel broke on a ridge road, and a human man with tired eyes and steady hands looked at a chieftess of the Stonefist clan and saw a person worth talking to rather than a monster or a prize. "I want to give you the mark. I want everyone who ever looks at you to know that you belong to me, the same way I have already given myself to belonging to you." She paused, searching his face. "But I will not take that choice from you. Tell me if this is too much, too fast, too strange a custom for a human heart, and I will not ask again." Emmett Walker, who had lost a name and a life and rebuilt himself twice over in 2 lonely years, looked at this fierce, magnificent woman offering him the deepest claim her people knew how to give, and felt the last of his old caution simply dissolve. "It's not too much," he said, voice rough. "Dura, I have been alone for so long I forgot what it felt like not to be. You didn't just choose me in that crowd. You've been choosing me every single day since, in 100 small ways, and I want to belong to you the same way. Give me the mark. I want it." She kissed him then, fierce and searching, and what followed was slower and deeper than the desperate warmth of the night before the duel, unhurried, thorough, both of them finally certain of exactly what they were building rather than racing against a fear of tomorrow. When she drew the small ceremonial blade from her belt afterward, her hand steady despite the intimacy of the moment, and cut the mark into his shoulder, a shallow, deliberate pattern of curved lines that would scar into something permanent, Emmett did not flinch, watching her face rather than the blade, watching the fierce concentration and the tenderness beneath it. "Now you," he said when it was done, taking the blade from her with hands that trembled only slightly, and she bared her own shoulder to him, trusting, and he cut the answering mark with as much care as he could manage, and when it was finished she examined it in the firelight with something like wonder. "It is done," she said softly. "There is no undoing this, Emmett Walker. Wherever you go, whatever comes, you are mine and I am yours by the oldest law my people know." "I wouldn't want it undone," he said, and pulled her close, and the storm howled outside the shuttered windows while inside, for the first time in 2 lonely years, Emmett Walker felt entirely, completely found. The storm broke on the 7th day, and the wagon road slowly opened again to traffic. But the closeness the enforced isolation had built between the Orc warband and the human residents of Split Rock did not simply vanish with the melting snow. Warriors who had shared storage rooms and cook fires with drovers and trappers through the worst of the storm had found, in most cases, that the fear and prejudice each side carried into that closeness did not survive close acquaintance nearly as well as either side had expected. Marshal Bellwether, watching Orc warriors and human trappers share a pot of stew in the trading hall on the morning the storm finally broke, remarked to Emmett that he had not seen anything like it in all his years at the post, and that whatever else came of the winter, it had done more good for the treaty than a decade of careful diplomacy. But the peace was not left entirely undisturbed. Garrett Voss, humiliated by the duel and increasingly isolated as post-opinion turned against him through the winter, made one final, desperate attempt to reignite the old feud in early spring, riding out with a dozen armed hands to drive cattle onto the disputed northern range under cover of a night raid, hoping to provoke Dura's clan into a retaliation that would justify, after the fact, a wider war he believed he could win with enough hired guns. It was Emmett, working late at the forge and catching sight of Voss's riders moving north under a thin spring moon, who raised the alarm riding hard through the dark to warn Dura's camp before the cattle drive could be mistaken for the opening move of an armed incursion. Dura met him at the edge of her camp, already half-armored, having heard the alarm bell from the post carried faintly on the wind. "Voss?" she asked, reading it in his face. "Driving cattle onto the range, 12 men trying to bait a fight," Emmett said, breathless. "If your warriors ride out armed to meet him, it'll look exactly like the incursion he wants to provoke, and Bellwether won't be able to protect you from what happens after, treaty or not." Dura's jaw tightened, weighing the danger, and then she made a decision with the same swift, fierce decisiveness that had led her to name him champion in a frightened crowd months before. "Then we do not ride out armed for war. We ride out to stand between the cattle and the land, unarmed but for what we always carry, and let every witness see plainly who provoked what." It was a dangerous gamble. Orc warriors approaching armed ranch hands without drawn weapons, trusting entirely in the moral weight of restraint to carry the moment rather than force. But Dura led her honor guard out into the pale spring dawn exactly as she'd said, weapons sheathed, standing in a line across the disputed range with nothing but her own fierce presence between Voss's cattle and the grazing land they had no right to claim. Emmett rode with her, unarmed as well, standing at her side rather than behind her, and when Voss arrived at the head of his riders and found not an armed warband ready for battle, but a line of Orc warriors standing calm and unarmed with a human blacksmith beside their chieftess, something in the tableau broke the last of his resolve. "This is your grazing land by treaty, Voss," Emmett called out across the pale dawn grass, his voice steady. "Everyone here knows it. Everyone on this range right now will remember exactly what they saw happen next. If you drive those cattle forward against unarmed people standing on their own rightful land, that's not a border dispute anymore. That's murder in front of a dozen witnesses, and I don't think even your own hired men will follow you into that." Voss looked at his own riders, several of whom were already shifting uneasily in their saddles, unwilling to be party to gunning down unarmed people regardless of their color, and found, as he had found in the Commons months before, that his cause had no support left to stand on. He turned his cattle drive around without a word and rode back south, and it was the last real trouble the Split Rock trading post ever saw from him. Within the month, unable to hold his hired hands' loyalty after 2 humiliations, he sold his ranch and left the region entirely, and the treaty line held, unchallenged from that spring onward. Dura, watching him go, let out a long breath and turned to Emmett with something like wonder in her expression. "You stood unarmed in front of armed riders for me." "I stood unarmed in front of armed riders for what's right," Emmett said, "which happens to be the same thing as standing for you most days." She laughed, that low, warm sound, and pulled him into a fierce embrace right there on the disputed range, uncaring of the warriors watching, and the pale spring dawn broke fully over the high plains grass while the two of them held each other, the last thread of danger finally, truly past. In the seasons that followed, the trading post of Split Rock became something of a legend along the wagon road, not merely for the story of the duel, which was told and embellished at every tavern from the eastern valleys to the river crossings, but for the strange, hopeful thing that grew out of it. An Orc Chieftess and a human blacksmith, plainly, openly in love, living at the edge of a post where Orc and human traders increasingly did business side by side without the old fear hanging quite so heavy over every exchange. Dura did not abandon her clan or her responsibilities to live quietly as a blacksmith's wife. She remained chieftess, riding regularly between her people's encampment and the post, and Emmett understood and respected the shape of her duty without ever asking her to be smaller than she was. Instead, he built a second forge at the edge of her clan's camp, splitting his time between both places, and it became common within a year to see the chieftess of the Stonefist clan working the bellows at her own mate's forge while he shaped iron, the two of them talking and laughing in a way that had become, for the whole region, a kind of quiet proof that the old feuds did not have to be the whole of the story. On a warm evening in early autumn, a full year after the trial by combat that had changed both their lives, Emmett Walker stood at the edge of his forge yard at Split Rock, watching the sun go down gold and orange over the ridge road, and felt Dura's arms slide around him from behind, her chin resting against his shoulder, over the scar that marked him as hers. "You are thinking too hard again," she murmured. "I can feel it in your shoulders." "I was thinking," Emmett said, turning in her arms to face her, "about the day you pointed at me across that crowd. I keep trying to figure out what you saw in a soot-covered blacksmith that made you decide, right then, that I was worth the risk." Dura considered this, her amber-brown eyes warm in the fading light, one hand coming up to rest against his jaw. "I saw a man who was not afraid to work, even when the work was hard and dangerous, and who did not look at me the way most of your kind look at mine, not with fear and not with hatred, but simply as a person worth knowing. I have met warriors who feared nothing on a battlefield and still flinched from meeting my eyes as an equal. You never flinched, Emmett Walker. Not once from the very first day. I didn't have the sense to be afraid of you," he admitted, smiling. "I was too busy being distracted by how beautiful you were, sitting on that log watching me work." She laughed, pulling him closer. "You are still distracted by it, I have noticed. I plan to stay distracted for the rest of my life if you'll have me." "I have already claimed you," Dura said, low and fierce and full of warmth, tracing the mark on his shoulder through his shirt with gentle fingers. "There is no version of my life now that does not have you in it, Emmett. You are not merely the man I chose in a frightened crowd. You are the man I choose every morning I wake beside you, and every evening I come home to this forge, and every single day in between. That is what love is, I think, not a single choosing, but choosing again and again, until the choosing itself becomes as natural as breathing." Emmett Walker, who had spent 2 long years believing himself destined to be forgotten, unwanted, a disgraced knight hiding behind a false name at the edge of a dusty trading post, felt something in his chest settle into a peace he had never quite believed he would earn. "I love you," he said simply, the words easy now after a year of proving them in 100 different ways. "I loved you before I understood what I was feeling, standing over a broken wagon wheel, and I love you more now than I knew was possible then. Whatever name I carry, whatever life comes after this one, I want it to be beside you." "Then it will be," Dura Stonefist said, with the same fierce, unshakable certainty she brought to every vow she had ever made, and kissed him as the sun finished setting over the high plains road, gold light fading into the soft blue of an early autumn evening. Two people who had found, against every improbable circumstance the wagon road had thrown at them, exactly where they belonged. The trading post settled into its evening rhythms around them, lanterns being lit along the commons, the smell of wood smoke and cooking drifting from the saloon, a trapper's laughter carrying faint on the cooling air, and Emmett Walker stood in the circle of Dura Stonefist's arms, feeling, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, entirely and completely unafraid of tomorrow. He was no longer Sir Emmett Draven, stripped of name and honor, nor merely Emmett Walker, the quiet blacksmith who kept to himself and asked no one to know him too well. He was simply, finally, hers, chosen, claimed, and wanted exactly as he was, by a woman fierce and magnificent enough to have chosen anyone in the world, who had looked across a frightened crowd and seen, in him alone, something worth the whole of her heart. And as the last light faded over the ridge road and the first stars came out cold and bright above the high plains, Dura Stonefist rested her forehead against his and said, quietly, for no one but him to hear, "Welcome home, Emmett Walker." And he understood at last, standing there in the circle of her arms with the forge fire glowing warm behind them, that after 2 years and a lifetime of loneliness, he finally truly was